After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and two others of the disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were able to haul it. They cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord. He put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. But they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and to go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." May the Lord bless this reading of the Scriptures. I think I'll preach from this side. With the absence of the choir, all the sinners have moved this way. And so, some of you that are new, sometimes I preach on that side. Today's sermon, I hope, will be a little bit shorter. I know that's your prayer every week, but today we have really two fascinating passages of Scripture. We could get caught up in the glittery part of the stories, the miraculous parts. We could even get stuck there if we didn't see that the encounters described were beginning places and not results. They were just at the beginning of things. We're in this period that in the lectionary and the church year, this is the Easter period. I was thinking this morning, that, that all of these periods that we marked off in the church calendar, Lent and Advent and Lent, and then we have Easter, and then we have Pentecost, and then we have what's called, the just ordinary times. But all of them seem to have an anticipation element to it. So like we were all through Lent, we were anticipating Easter. Then we had Easter, and now we're anticipating Pentecost. People are waiting in both of these. In Lent, they're on a journey. They're on a spiritual journey and we are invited as God's people to sort of go on a virtual journey to find ourselves and to find God again, to look for God, and to give up, and to think about the suffering of Jesus and anticipate the resurrection. And then we have Easter, and there's a big celebration. And then in the lives of the disciples, there was this big celebration. There was this awareness that came. People, at first they weren't sure. They didn't know anything had happened. And then Easter morning, there seemed to be something happening. And the women saw Jesus. And then in John, Jesus came to the disciples a couple of times, and then he hung around with them, sort of, and he promised that something was going to happen. And he promised that it points toward Pentecost. In the gospel reading today, in John, we have Jesus' third appearance to his disciples after his resurrection. That's what it says in that passage, but actually it was the fourth appearance. His first appearance was with Mary Magdalene in the garden in John, as John portrays it, and he was with Mary Magdalene. And then he saw them, and he came to see the disciples. They were hiding, sort of locked themselves in one place, sort of afraid to wander out because I think the seriousness of the movement that Jesus had started, had to sink in with them as they saw Jesus crucified, and there probably was genuine fear among them, and so they were gathered, locked in a room, and suddenly Jesus was with them. But Thomas isn't there. So Jesus comes back later, and Thomas is there, and there's this powerful conversation with Thomas where Jesus chides Thomas for not believing. And so John, the writer of John, says, okay, there were three appearances, but actually that was the third one. Mary, and they saw Jesus once, the disciples once, and then they saw Jesus. Jesus saw the disciples again. They just didn't count Mary's as one of the disciples. Not to say that the writer was completely impacted by his culture, but it seems that way to me. But anyway, so in today's gospel, we have this story. Jesus comes to a group of disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. Now, Sea of Tiberias is the same as the Sea of Galilee. It's just in John, it's called the Sea of Tiberias. We don't know the whole story. We don't know why a group of Jesus' disciples decided to go fishing. Perhaps they were strapped for cash. It could be. These were professional fishermen. It could be that their money. There's not much mention of in the Gospels about the cash flow of the disciples, and so it could be that maybe they had run out of resources. Maybe they were hungry. Maybe they went fishing because they not only needed money, but they needed something to eat. Perhaps they were tired of being cooped up, hiding out. They were waiting for Jesus again, and the nature, in particular, of some of the disciples, like Peter, is that they're doers. the little bit of sitting around goes a long way. It was going a long way with him. And so perhaps they were just tired of being cooped up, hiding out. And seeing Jesus earlier had given them hope. But just sitting, waiting for clearer instructions was sort of getting to them, I think. So Peter decided, I'm going fishing. And so some others say, okay, we'd like to go fishing too. And there's Thomas and Nathaniel and Zebedee brothers, James and John, and two other disciples whose names didn't make the book. Probably there were a lot of disciples after the book was written, they kept saying, that was me. That was me. I was me. But anyway, they said, let's do it. Let's go fishing. So they fished all night, but caught nothing. And in the boredom and the frustration of a night with no fishing luck, they probably were standing, looking at anything, any kind of distraction. And, somebody may have noticed that there was a man on the beach. And, but they were too far away from the shore, and the light was dim. So they really weren't sure who it was. Then they heard the man call out to them. He said, children? And I was wondering about that, because I've not seen that. I don't see Jesus talking to his disciples and calling them children, very much. And I thought, well, maybe they just assumed that he's calling them children, that the man is older. But Jesus really wasn't older than some of his disciples. Or maybe the fact that he said children indicated that he was a rabbi, that he was a teacher, that he, and there are probably some of you that have professors that probably thinks that all, but children can't be in the classroom. But so the man called out children, and he said, throw your net on the right side of the boat. Now, among the disciples in this bunch, there were some experienced fishermen. This is how they made their living. And they had already fished probably the right side, the left side, every place that they could see the fish. And they had caught nothing. But instead of arguing with the stranger, they probably shrugged their rear shoulders and mumbled to each other, we want, okay, we'll give it a try, or something, maybe something more customary for fishermen to say. I don't know what that would be. But he says, anyway, what's another cast? We've been casting all night. We've been throwing the net out there all night, so what's another one? They had no sooner gotten the net underwater when the fish began to fill. And maybe someone muttered, it's a miracle. And that's when it dawned on them, maybe, that the man on the beach may be Jesus. Because during this period of time, when Jesus had appeared to them, the scriptures say that he had done miraculous works. And they had seen Jesus do miraculous works. And so the awareness that a miracle had just taken place, they may have connected that and said, oh, maybe it's Jesus. Peter heard one of them say that it's the Lord. So he had been stripped down for this fishing expedition. He threw on his clothes and swam to shore, forgetting all about the fish that he had been so concerned about all night long, the ones that he hadn't been able to catch. And there he found Jesus cooking breakfast there on the beach. And there's not much of a record of the conversation of the breakfast conversation. But as the disciples came in, Jesus said, bring some more fish. So they brought more fish, and they had this breakfast feast there, fish and bread. And I'd like to think that Jesus, who's probably might carried on the same kind of conversation with his disciples that maybe we would have. Nathaniel, Have you heard from your family lately? You know, James, how's Zebedee doing? How's your dad doing? Thomas, do you guys let your families know that you're all right? Yeah. But during the breakfast, Peter was a bit aloof because there was this thing that was between him and Jesus. You know, he had, on the night that Jesus was turned over to the soldiers for crucifixion, he had been asked 3 times if he was one of Jesus' friends. And he had been, and 3 times he had denied that he ever knew Jesus. That night he'd been confused and he'd been afraid. And he'd hoped that Jesus maybe would just sort of let it go. You know, he'd been there, you had an issue with somebody, and it's eating at you, but it sort of is between you. And all of us that are married have those kinds of things probably at some time or another. You know, relative never happened. But in relationships, there are these things that occur, and until they're dealt with, until they're opened up, they remain there. You know, I can remember plenty of times with, you know, I had issues with people, particularly when growing up, I had issues with my parents. You know, and and on the one hand, I would hope that we would never talk about, you know, the dent in the car. You know, but on the other hand, it was there. It was there and needed to be dealt with. And so, you know, so here Peter, Jesus is hosting the fish cookout, and there's this thing that's there. It's sort of like an infection that needed to be lanced. So Jesus touches his soul at the spot of his shame and exposes his guilt to the light of his presence and his love. The light of Jesus' presence and love. Through denials, Jesus asked him 3 times if he loves him. And each time Peter responds with an affirmative answer. Often preachers point out that different verbs are used, you know, in the different kinds of love. And that's a good thing to look at, but we're not going to do that today. But in this questioning, this time when Jesus is saying, "Do you love me, Peter?" And Peter gets more and more agitated because he becomes more and more aware that what Jesus is really getting at. And what Jesus is getting at is, you've got this thing in you, Peter. This thing that came because you denied. There's guilt there and there's shame there. And the only way that it can be resolved is by owning it. I glean from this passage today, there are sort of 2 things. There's a lot that we can glean from it. One is that the road to reconciliation is a road to the light and joy, but it usually passes through darkness to get there. Jesus asked 3 times, "Do you love me?" Each time Peter is forced to look at that for which he was ashamed. It's as though he had to go there in order to get beyond that. You know, in the AA community, you know, that owning oneself is an important part of the process of healing, for freedom, finding freedom. In my own experience, there are times when there's been an issue that I've had an issue with someone. Maybe the person did not have an issue with me, but I had an issue, not because of something they did, but because of something I did. And it was just there. Until I went there and exposed it to the light, it stayed there. Because it was something that I was always afraid would eventually be found out or would be explored. reconciliation goes by a dark place usually. The second thing is that reconciliation is not the end. Service is the end. Each time Peter affirms his love for Jesus, Jesus tells him to feed his sheep, to care for his flock. I wonder if when Jesus said to Peter, feed my lambs, feed my sheep, perhaps he even sort of pointed to the guys that were standing around, they were eating fish. That is because they were some of the lambs and fish and sheep that were a part of Jesus' flock. So the road to reconciliation goes by maybe even through the pain of darkness, and it leads to something else. It leads to purpose. The encounter with the resurrected Lord is not just about forgiveness. It's about bringing forgiveness and kindness and care to others. It's in the Easter encounters, there was this coming together and this sense of resolution and something. Here is Jesus; he really is alive. But there was also this imperative part of it too, that you go and tell. And not only do you go and tell, but you go and offer the same kind of love and reconciliation that you experience with God. And so in our Easter experience, we are sort of called as we come before Jesus, and we Baptists don't talk too much about confession. Don't get nervous, I'm not going to ask you. But the confession is a very important part of relationships, and our relationships with others, and our relationship with Jesus. Sometimes the issues that are going on between people, the beginning of reconciliation of that occurs in a reconciliation experience with God. Sometimes if I feel estranged from another person, I take that to God first. Other times when I feel estranged, I take it to others first. And it doesn't really matter which way it works. The important thing is that which stands between us, between me and God, me and you, those things are discovered and light is shining on them. And if they need to be lanced, they get lanced. I want to say just a word about Paul's encounter with Jesus. Paul was a persecutor of Christians. He saw them as distorters of Judaism. But in route to arrest some Christians, he's blinded by a light and surprised by the voice of Jesus who confronts him. Paul is blinded and remains blinded until he encounters a Christian named Ananias, who, though afraid of Paul, obeys God and shows Paul brotherly love. Paul's encounter with Jesus does not just end his persecution of Christians, but it shapes him into the great missionary of faith. And I guess what I wanted to point out there is that in this encounter that Paul had with Jesus, there was this confrontational part of it. Why do you persecute me, Paul? And then there was, out of that came this great purpose, as the purpose of Paul. Again, the reconciliation went beyond the moment and gave purpose to the person. Some of you may be aware that and maybe some of you don't even know who Rachel Held Evans was. Rachel Held Evans is an author that I really appreciate. Helen and I heard her speak a year or so ago, maybe 2 years ago, at King Avenue Methodist Church. And she's I've appreciated her because as she writes, in her books you can see her growing. And she has I like people who they sort of raise the same questions that I have, you know, and she does. And some of you, and if you're a Rachel Held Evans fan, did not know this, but Rachel died just yesterday. And so I went to review his book, and I thought I would just read you something that she wrote about Paul. She said, originally a persecutor of Christians, Paul experienced dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus one day. When a blinding light threw him to the ground, and a voice from heaven said, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Despite their fears, the Christians in Damascus and Jerusalem welcomed Paul into their homes and cared for him until his sight was restored. Acts of radical, risky hospitality that undoubtedly shaped Paul's posture toward others in the years to come. As he came to terms with this divine interruption in his own story, Paul began to understand its place in a larger story and to preach Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah, whose life, death, and resurrection fulfilled biblical prophecy, in particular, Isaiah's vision that Israel would be a light for the Gentiles that would bring salvation to the ends of the earth. The message of good news for all people of all nations became Paul's obsession. As he traveled the region with other followers of Jesus, sharing the gospel in cities across Asia and Europe, he almost always preached first to the Jews in the synagogues and then to the Gentiles at their marketplaces, academic forums, and homes. He described himself as a slave to everyone, willing to become all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. Reconciliation, becoming attuned to God, makes for the ebb and flow of life as God intends it. Accompanying forgiveness is a call to purpose, a call to service, a call to caring for others, a call to feed Christ's lambs, a call to feed Christ's sheep. It's our call. Reconciliation of oneness with God is a gift. And Jesus is continually giving that gift to us. And as we receive that gift, then the purpose that he has for us becomes clearer. And for me, it usually takes place as I take a step down the road and attempt something. And so we have these two pictures today. Two people